This is going to be the very first episode of the Instrumentarium podcast. It's an offshoot of the bandistration.com website that I run. I'm here with my friend Matthew Banks.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here, Brett.
This ought to be fun. Format of this is we're going to be talking about different musical instruments, particularly focusing on wind instruments. That's both of our areas of expertise. And, history, construction, different brands, playing, composition, pretty much anything within the realm of the instruments. And today we're going to be looking at one of the most maligned instruments in band and orchestra, and that is the alto clarinet. Matt here has a lot more experience on alto clarinet than I do. He is a professional clarinet player.
Yes. I have a degree in clarinet performance from a tiny college in Indiana that no one's heard about, but I've been playing alto clarinet since I went to college. My very first concert in the school's top ensemble, the wind ensemble, they gave me a plastic Bundy alto clarinet and told me I was playing Lincolnshire Posy. So that was my very first exposure to the instrument. And since then, I've experimented with several different brands. School, believe it or not, had 4 instruments. I played on Bundys. I played on a Yamaha, which is a much better upgrade. But then I found a LeBlanc, an older LeBlanc from the 1960s, I believe. I bought a good mouthpiece, and much to the chagrin of my professors, I decided to play this instrument whenever possible, playing especially viola transcriptions and whatnot. At this point, I own my own Noble alto clarinet, as well as 2 mouthpieces, and I have a lot of experience on all of the clarinets in general.
I'm a bassoonist by trade, so clarinet is really my tertiary instrument. I don't play clarinet as nearly as well as I'd like. But I too have a Noble alto. I've got mine sitting next to me. I've completely overhauled mine. I got it probably 2 months ago now, maybe 3 months ago now, and done complete overhaul from top to bottom, new pads. I still need to get a new mouthpiece. I've got the original mouthpiece, actually original 2 mouthpieces it came from. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the big thing I did is a huge improvement to the instrument is I went ahead and installed a floor peg. I ordered a bass clarinet peg and just soldered it onto the bell, and man, it makes a huge difference in how well the instrument can be held, and it takes the weight off. You don't have to use a neck strap, although you can use both in combination. But I think we probably need to talk about alto clarinet and why people dislike it so very much. What is your background, your thoughts on why people think the alto clarinet is such a terrible instrument?
I think part of it comes from the way in educational ensembles you voice out your harmony clarinets. If you put the worst player, like clarinet 15 in a section of 15 on alto clarinet, even if he's got a great instrument, he's going to sound bad. Also, alto clarinets lag behind most other clarinets, especially B-flats and basses, in terms of their key work, advancements, and placing of tone holes for everything to be in tune. As Mark Wolbers, the professor of clarinet at the University of Anchorage, noted in his paper. The other big thing I think that stands in the instrument's way is that it's not many composers don't creatively score for it. Granger being the exception, it's most often used to double the third clarinet part, or a bass clarinet part, or most egregiously, I think, double one of the alto saxophone parts, the instruments having almost nothing in common in terms of their sounds.
I agree with all of that, and then there's one other thing that I would add to that, and it's mouthpiece. And I discovered this recently. I have 2 alto clarinet mouthpieces. The one I've got on there right now is just a standard stock Yamaha, I think a 5C mouthpiece. But the other mouthpiece that came to my instrument is an original Bundy mouthpiece. And I put that on there the other day to see what kind of sound quality it would produce. And the sound quality was just atrocious. It was whiny, it was pinched, it squeaked. In fact, the alto clarinet reed, I was using a good Van Doren reed on there, and it didn't even fit on the mouthpiece. The mouthpiece was designed for a reed that was considerably smaller, but I don't think Van Doren, and you may correct me here, has changed the size of the alto clarinet reed.
If it has, it hasn't been recent. Van Doren, for example, with their contrabass clarinet reeds, originally built contrabass clarinet reeds to fit the giant mouthpiece that LeBlanc's paperclips used. Since the 70s, they've moved to contralto, contrabass hybrid reed that can be used for either instrument. But there's been no significant change in alto clarinet reed design, I think, since the 70s or 60s.
So you've got this original Bundy mouthpiece. It doesn't work. I mean, the reeds don't even fit on it. So you've got a huge equipment problem. And my guess is band directors, when they originally got these instruments, had the stock Bundy mouthpiece that came with their stock Bundy alto clarinet. And I guess while we're on the subject of Bundy, let's talk about that particular instrument a little bit. That was my original alto clarinet that I since sold nearly a decade ago. And you said you played on one. You want to describe why the Bundy's fairly deficient?
The instrument wasn't in tune with itself when I played it. And the use of rings instead of palette keys for a lot of the fingers really lended itself to not being stable. I honestly don't know, it's been a while, how much of the horn's behavior was because of the mouthpiece, as you noted, but it's just not modernly well designed. And certain pitches like low F, low E, and low E flat on those instruments are especially flat.
My junior high that I taught at this past year had a Bundy, and I used it some. I played on it for a while, then I switched a student over. We had a Selmer mouthpiece with it, though. So we had a Selmer C-Star on this older Bundy open-hole instrument, and it did make a lot of difference. This instrument sounded a lot better with that Selmer C-Star mouthpiece. That said, I still didn't think it was optimal sound. Now, let's talk about some of the others. Let's go ahead and talk about the LeBlanc Noble Vito instruments. The Vito is probably the most commonly available nowadays. I guess they're calling it now the LeBlanc, but it used to be the Vito. It's the plastic instrument. Have you ever played one of those?
Yes, at a clarinet fest a couple of years ago.
Overall impression of it?
This will sound bad, but it's better than the Bundy.
Yeah, and from what my understanding is, it's basically the Noble horn, but in the hard plastic with not quite as professional key work as the main LeBlanc.
Yes, I recall its keys, it may just be an inferior material, but they got out of alignment very easily. And its octave system, the vent keys that change register to register, was much more primitive than, say, either of our Nobles or the LeBlanc I played on.
Right. Now, the Noble is the earlier LeBlanc model. They're made by LeBlanc, but this is an all wooden instrument. They're two-piece instruments and with a two-piece neck. So this is far superior than a lot of things available today, even though it was marketed as a student instrument.
Certainly, yes.
In my research, the only difference I found actually between the LeBlanc and the Noble is the shape of the neck. The Nobles have that characteristic swan neck. I'm sorry, the LeBlancs have the characteristic swan neck. It almost looks like a miniature bass clarinet neck. But the Noble has the about 45-degree angle neck.
Yes, and I've noticed, I somewhat doubt there's any real difference in the necks other than the swan will develop resistance, but there's a huge aesthetic value difference. People will pay a lot more money for the LeBlancs, even though they can't adjust their tuning as easily because the neck isn't two-piece.
Right, and evidently with the swan neck on the LeBlancs, it makes it extremely difficult if you want to put a peg on there because the position is meant to be held very far back. So almost at a 45-degree angle against the body, whereas with the peg on there, you can hold the instrument straight up and down at a 90-degree angle to the floor.
Yes, and the peg is a must, I believe. I agree with you wholeheartedly.
And you haven't put that on yours yet. You're still waiting to bring that up to me so I can do it for you, right?
Definitely.
The addition of the peg really makes it feel much more secure. You know, I've got a nice peg here with a soft rubber ball on the end that won't slip on the floor. There's a couple other makes of alto clarinet out there. Of course, the Buffet and the Selmer. And you and I both played a Buffet at TMEA this year, and that was an absolutely phenomenal instrument.
Agreed.
Yeah, it played as well as any other clarinet you could possibly think of.
And much like Buffet's advanced bass clarinets, its low E flat, rather than venting through the main bell, had a vent at the bottom of the curve in the bell, which would allow you, if you wanted to plug that up, to reach a low D, if you wanted to play basset horn notes. But it also made the instrument more in tune.
Particularly those low notes, too, because the low notes in the low shallow mode tend to go fairly flat, don't they?
Very much so. That's a big problem with bigger clarinets like the alto and bass.
And then, have you ever tried a Selmer?
I have not. And they're kind of hard to find. Like, I hear about the Series 9, that'll float up from time to time on eBay, and the Model 22 Selmer Paris, which I see listed.
I've heard the 9 is better than the 22 as far as intonation goes. I've heard the 22s are the ones that have some serious intonation problems down in the low range.
Oh yes, they've been described as 30 to 40 cents flat, which would make it perfect for playing Turkish music, you know, but not quite what we need.
No, you need that thing in tune. Are there any other makes out there that are still currently making alto clarinets?
One other make that's currently made is the Yamaha. I think the code is YCC631. I played it at a clarinet colloquium put on by A&M Commerce, and it's about midway between where great instruments like the Prestige, the Noblesse are, and where Bundy's, and I think for intonation purposes sometimes Selmer's would be. It played fine, but then when I moved over to a Prestige, there was no comparison.
Yamaha has actually discontinued their student model alto clarinet. They only have the professional wooden instrument now. And if I remember right, the student model instrument, the plastic instrument, was made with LeBlanc Vito parts.
Yes, that's where it gets really confusing.
Yeah, we've got different manufacturers using parts from other manufacturers.
Yes. At school, I used the student Yamaha instrument until I discovered the LeBlanc. And it played well enough, but its key work fell out of adjustment very, very easily. And it's not designed to be a two-piece horn. So rather than having a cork between the top joint and the middle joint, there's a screw system that can be attached, but ideally it's supposed to stay in place.
And that's like the modern LeBlancs, or modern Vitos, I should say.
Yes, I believe so.
You want to talk about the bore shape. With all the different sizes of clarinets, I think alto clarinet differs wildly on bore size.
I agree. There hasn't been a standard made yet like there is for B-flats or even bassos.
And the B-flat clarinet is, what again? It's 15.5 millimeters?
Yes.
And I think Buffet's A clarinet is just slightly bigger than that. I think it's 15.55. It's like 0.05 of a millimeter bigger. But Yeah, we've got basically two different types of alto clarinets out there. There's the medium bore and the large bore. There's no real small bore instruments.
Yes. I can't corroborate this, but the Selmer instruments, like the Selmer Paris, is closer to small bore size. Like I think they're around 16 millimeters or 16.5. I might need to do some research on that, but they seem almost discontinued, you know?
But the LeBlancs are the real big bore instruments. The LeBlancs, the Noblet, and what are we looking at? Are those 18 millimeter?
Exactly, 18 millimeters.
With that 18 millimeter, you get a much bigger projection, a little bit darker sound, easier to control.
Yes, and I think in alto clarinet construction, like the bigger the bore is for these instruments, the closer it is in tune with itself.
And I think that we can get back to the open hole versus closed hole with those old Bundys. The only way you can have an open hole system is if you have a narrow bore instrument. So the open hole kind of defeats itself.
Agreed.
So a big bore LeBlanc or Noblet is really kind of the ideal.
I agree. It works better. But I have to note also, I think the Prestige, the top-of-the-line instrument, which, funny enough, costs more than Buffet's best bass clarinets, its bore size is either 17 or 17 and a half. It's right below the LeBlancs.
But it's an absolutely phenomenal instrument.
Agreed.
Now, next thing I think we should probably discuss is the name. And you and I have both talked about this before, and neither one of us kind of like the name alto clarinet. It's not an alto instrument. Its lowest note, with a low E instrument, it'd be a G at the bottom line of the bass clef, or a low E flat instrument, it's a G flat half step below that. It's a tenor instrument. It's not in the alto range.
It doesn't fit that range very well either in terms of key work.
Right, so if we call and think of the instrument as a tenor clarinet, then it takes on a completely different role. I mean, the standard B-flat clarinet fits more in line with an alto range already. So an instrument a fifth below that is more in line with a tenor.
I agree, and that might give bandistrators a way to escape the stigma that a name can attach to an instrument.
Right, by calling it a tenor clarinet, it's going to take on the very similar role that the tenor sax will. And there's really kind of an an analog with the alto clarinet and the tenor sax. No one in their right mind would leave out a tenor saxophone. The alto clarinet should fill the same role that the tenor sax does. If you're going soprano, alto, tenor, bass, you're basically going soprano, alto, bass. And you're leaving out the tenor line. And in a band, in the wind section, the tenor voice is the least represented voice in there. You've got first bassoon covering that line. You've got tenor sax covering that line. And that is it until you add in alto clarinet. If you want to get really exotic, you can throw in a bass oboe, which is really a tenor oboe, to cover that line as well. But that's beyond rare.
Oh, yes. The alto clarinet, I take comfort in it being slightly more common and accepted than a bass oboe in the band, you know?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, how many pieces in band literature do you know call for a bass oboe?
I can only think of that one fantastic piece, Children's March by Granger.
Right, and that's never done with a bass oboe. It's always done with an English horn.
Yes, which is unfortunate.
It is, but you and I both know that the bass oboe is exceedingly rare. And we'll talk about bass oboe in another episode.
Fantastic, yeah.
But alto clarinet probably needs to be discussed in combination with another instrument, and that is the basset horn. And you played a little basset horn. I played one for the first time at TMEA this past February. But tell us a little bit about the basset horn.
The basset horn is one of the oldest clarinets. It was created in 1770 something or another by a designer named Grobner, and it's a F tenor instrument pitched a fourth below the clarinet in B flat. With key work, it's always had this key work that extends it down to a written low C. This was the lowest clarinet that we had available until they perfected the bass clarinet. And it's only been used significantly by two orchestral composers, which is more than the alto clarinet's ever had, but still rare. Mozart, the original drafts of the famous clarinet concerto were for a basset horn in G. He used it in the Grand Partita, Masonic funeral music, and the Requiem. And then Richard Strauss revived the instrument in Elektra and a couple of his later operas. The instrument ideally has a smaller bore and is intended to be more clarinet-like in its upper registers.
Yeah, and you look at the Mozart writing for basset horn, and he keeps it up in its upper range almost all the time. You look at the basset horn parts in the Requiem, and they're all in the clarino range. They're not going down into the shallow to get those extra low notes on either first basset or second basset. I don't think either go down into the low notes at all.
Yes, in a direct comparison, nothing exceeds the range of your standard B-flat clarinet, which tells me Mozart could have used normal clarinets, but he chose the basset because he loved its sound.
Right. This is a great example of a composer specifically wanting a specific tone color. The notes could be there by A clarinet, by B flat clarinet, probably by C clarinet, but they're not going to have, I love this phrase, the unctuous seriousness of the basset horn.
That's fantastic.
I didn't come up with that. That's an old description. It may come from George Bernard Shaw. I can't remember. But basset horn and alto clarinet are basically brother and sister to one another. They're only pitched a step apart. Yet they're thought of so vastly differently. Alto clarinet has never once been used in a symphony orchestra. Do you know a single piece that calls for an E-flat alto clarinet in orchestral literature?
Not a one.
I don't either. I mean, I wrote a piece once as an undergrad that called for E-flat alto, but that doesn't count. Student works don't count, but for real works, there's not a single piece that calls for the E-flat alto clarinet. I can find a piece for every other size of clarinet, maybe with the exception of the contralto. No, I take that back. I know a contralto piece as well. I know every other clarinet's been used in the orchestra except the E-flat alto. And there probably is some of our bias there.
Oh, yes. Well, when an instrument's barred from the symphony orchestra, it gets a stigma attached to it, just like the saxophones were for a while in the early 20th century.
But even then, before that, you've got saxophone pieces from the 1800s all the way back to the 1850s at least.
That is true.
But, E-flat alto clarinet never has once made an appearance in the symphony orchestra. And I don't know why. It could be that always thought of as a band instrument, and they had access to the basset horn. Now, basset horns do make appearances in band music, particularly band music of the harmony music school. That's music written throughout the 1800s, Viennese school. You'll find lots of pieces for harmony. Mendelssohn wrote several pieces. I did a modern instrumentation of his Trauer March as an undergrad. It calls for 2 F clarinets, 2 C clarinets, and 2 basset horns. Well, since we had access to none of those, I did it for two E flats, two A's, and two altos, and it worked absolutely beautifully. You know, you could hear the original sound of the harmony music.
Yes.
So basset horn was used quite a bit in Germany and eastward. And it seems that the alto clarinet was relegated to France and England and then migrated over to the United States.
And the English have always called it the tenor clarinet for the most part.
Well, that not always. They did that some in the 1800s, but even then, by some point, they were calling it the alto clarinet. So you can find tenor clarinet in old English band scores, but that died away after a while. But you find it's almost one of those things, very much a nationalistic divide. So you don't find a lot of alto clarinet or basset horn parts in English or French music.
Very much so. Much like you don't find saxophone music. No, saxophones in a lot of German scores.
Not until 1920s or past when you start getting some jazz influence in German scores. Strauss had that one experiment in Symphonia Domestica, but I think everybody will agree that was very much a failure on his part. And we'll talk Symphonia Domestica later.
Oh yes, scoring for instruments that are either extremely rare or don't exist.
Yes, and in a non-important role. That's probably a good segue to talking about how to actually write for the alto clarinet. As a performer, what would you like to see on an alto clarinet roll?
In an alto clarinet roll, what I want to see most is it carry lines as an only clarinet in a mixed melody. Like, too often you'll pair the alto clarinet with a section of thirds, and its sound will get easily observed if there's too many third players. Or if you pair it with the bass, us playing on our giant souped-up French bass clarinets, its sound will get absorbed too. But I'd love to see the alto clarinet in combination with bassoons especially. I think it can blend and support a lot of the bassoon's best range. It works well with oboes. I think it works a little bit better with English horn and oboe than the normal clarinet does, because it's a little bit mellower.
I agree there. In fact, in my last completed band piece, Omnia Exeunt in Mysterium, I have long lines in there that are completely in unison between alto clarinet and English horn. In that particular piece, I scored for alto clarinet in F, which is the basset horn, but there's alternate part provided for the E-flat instrument. It produces very much a haunting sound. You've got the nasalness of the English horn combined with the smooth, slightly reedy sound of the alto clarinet.
Very much so. And the alto clarinet, for me, its ranges stand out in sharper contrast than the B-flats do. Like, in its upper register, it preserves a certain amount of darkness and silveriness, which can be compared to the clarinet, though it sounds a lot stronger. Like the range from E-flat 4 to E-flat 5, much stronger and secure on the alto clarinet as opposed to the B-flat clarinet. But its low register is also a lot darker, and you can really...
Yeah, the low register, I think, is just beautiful sounding.
Yes, even like anything below D3, the lowest pitch of the standard B-flat clarinet, it almost takes on the organ quality, the organ pedal quality of the B-flat basses and the contrabasses. Like just a dark, solid foundation from which to build something off of.
Right, so it can function down there more as a bass instrument, but up high, particularly the clarino range, I think it's got just a gorgeous sound up there.
It sounds a lot sweeter to me than the B-flat does. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I think it has much more personality than the B-flat clarinet does.
There's a reason that bands still get criticized as bland as B-flat,
Right. The B-flat clarinet It's, you may have a different opinion on this, but I find the B-flat clarinet to be the most boring sound of the clarinet family. And it could just be that that's the sound we're used to.
Yes, well, if you spend too much time getting exposed to B-flat, you do start to appreciate the little subtle differences between the A, the brightness of the C, and the cheerfulness of the E-flat,
Oh, absolutely. And the alto just furthers that. Now, I see a lot of talk about people saying, oh, you can just dispense with the alto clarinet because a good bass clarinet player can cover its whole range. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose that's accurate, but those two clarinets sound nothing the same. Like, would you want... And your comparison of the alto clarinet to the tenor saxophone is really great. Would you want the baritone saxophone to play a tenor saxophone line? It could technically do it, especially if the line doesn't make use of the altissimo range, but it'll just sound a little bit too heavy. It makes it ponderous and it removes a little bit of the flexibility. I think the same is true with the B-flat bass clarinet covering alto clarinet parts. It also exposes some of the bass clarinet's weakest notes to replace the alto's strongest, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, because you're going to be putting the bass clarinet a lot of times in the break register. And a good example of that is, I did a video a few weeks ago comparing the alto and bass clarinet in the big solo in Lincolnshire Posy. And the solo in the third movement of Lincolnshire Posy for alto clarinet lies absolutely beautifully on the alto clarinet. It goes up to a written A4, and it's cued in the bass clarinet part, and it's just completely awkward on the bass clarinet. Yes, the bass clarinet will have a little bit bigger sound. It might, sound a little bit more in tune, but it won't have the same tone quality that the alto does.
Certainly not. And I could have a whole rant about modern bass clarinet playing. They're just not the same instruments, and they shouldn't be treated that way and expected to function in the same ways.
Go into detail on that a little bit.
My thoughts on bass clarinet playing is so I remember you talking about in your bore charts how bass clarinets now are a little bit bigger proportionally than the rest of the clarinet family. Is that true?
Right, yeah. And I was plotting out the different bore sizes of all the clarinets, and there was very much an upward in the curve as you got to some of the really big bass clarinets. It just, the graph really went up much higher than it needed to.
Yes, you see, that's a reaction to instruments not being available, I believe. If you don't have a contralto or a contrabass, the strongest, most consistent, most dynamically flexible single reed bass you're going to have is the bass clarinet. How do you make it project more, especially if they're going to use it like on the marching field? You give it a bigger bore, which almost makes it a new instrument, kind of alien to the clarinet family. As a result, you'll get these big, powerful, snorty bass clarinet sounds, which kind of destroy a lot of the subtlety that the instrument's supposed to have. Like, a Prestige or one of the Toscas should not be used to play Wagner operas. All of that fantastic low writing for bass clarinet and B-flat and A,
It's almost like a lot of the modern bass clarinets are bass clarinets with contralto bore.
I think that's the intended effect, and that's certainly why they extend to low C, to cover that range D2 to B-flat 1 that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do.
I talked some with Chris Runk of the Dallas Symphony, and he plays on I think it's like early 1900s or right at 1900 instrument with a very small bore. And, he gets a phenomenal sound out on that instrument.
The best comparison we can do with that modern, until I get a Stephen Fox bass clarinet, which I have started to put my pennies away for, is to listen to how German clarinetists play on. Their instruments, the German clarinet bore, I can't give you figures, but I've been told, like in a conversation with Stephen Fox, that it's close to the bore of the LeBlanc alto clarinet, if only a little bit larger. and they use special-made German mouthpieces, and the sound is much darker, more subtle, and there's no real... They certainly can't roar like French instruments can, but they get the job done in terms of projection.
Yeah, Chris Runk told me that the German bass clarinets are almost like just big basset horns with a very compact bore.
Yes, and all German instruments, the German clarinet, B-flat clarinet, has a smaller bore than the French. And the bore doesn't taper at the bell like the bore doesn't expand at the bell like the French instruments do.
So let's get back to alto clarinet, and let's talk about the numbers of alto clarinets in the band. It going to depend, of course, on the ensemble. Let's talk about something that's not a wind ensemble, where it's one player on a part. So you have multiple players on a part. How many alto clarinets do you think should be in a band?
Never one or less. That's a bad answer, but I think it should really be proportional to the number of B-flat clarinets. So if you have a section of 12 B-flat clarinets, I don't know why you would have a section of 12 B-flat clarinets, but if you have them, you should have as many altos as one group of clarinets. Standard, we divide B-flat clarinets into 3 parts for band writing. So there ought to be 2 to 4 alto clarinets. 2 to 4 alto clarinets can hold their own against any one section of clarinets and bass clarinets and make an impact, I think.
Right. And so if you have a group of 12 B-flat clarinets, I would agree that you should have 3 or 4, because you're going to have 4 firsts, 4 seconds, 4 thirds, or 2, 4, 6, or however you want to divide that. But the alto clarinet, if you put 1 against 12, will never cut through. And that, I think, is another one of the areas where we find band conductors, band directors, disparaging the alto clarinet. Oh, I can never hear it. Well, no, duh. You've got 12 B-flat clarinets against 1 alto. That doesn't work in any section.
It'd be like the best example I gave. One of my band directors that I work with gave me that exact statement when I was talking about borrowing a school alto. You can use it. I can't hear it whenever we use it. It's like 1 tenor saxophone versus 12 alto saxophones. You're not going to hear the tenor. Doesn't matter how hard he's trying to blow. He's just knocked out by the mass of sound.
Right. So for that same ensemble, for 12 clarinets, 4 altos, how many basses?
That's kind of tricky, because a bass, the proportions for balancing bass to B-flat clarinets is a little different. A section of 12 clarinets, 12 regular B-flat clarinets, 2 basses can get the job done, but they might be a little honky. So I might go 3 or 4 too. That gives you 8 mid-low range clarinets to work with, which is a bit of a pipe dream, but I like the numbers.
Right, and that will give your woodwind section a phenomenal low bass and tenor range. That said, you're right, that's a pipe dream, because you're dealing now with 20 clarinets, and that's not counting your E-flats or your contras.
Yes, I was mulling over in my head, like, if you cut that number in half, I kind of like that. 6 B-flats, 2 altos, 2 basses. That you can work with in a ensemble efficiently, I think.
I think that's a much, much better scenario. You basically got it down to 2 players on a part. So 2 firsts, 2 seconds, 2 thirds, 2 altos, 2 basses. And now you have 12 players.
Yes, then the 1 contra and 1 contrabass don't have to work so hard to balance against everybody. And you still get a lot of... It's adding cellos to the band. Without adding cellos, I kind of like to think.
Right. And that's the sound that the band is missing. You hear a lot of bands' music, and it's missing this soft bottom and tenor range, and the instruments are there. It's the bass and the alto clarinet. And this goes back, Percy Granger harped on this. For Lincolnshire Posey, he's quoted as saying, I want 6 alto clarinets and 6 bass clarinets playing this piece. and I don't think he's ever gotten it.
Wow. That would change the sound so much.
The only time they wouldn't play as a group are the couple times it's Mark's solo. He doesn't have any real bass clarinet solos. They're all in the alto clarinet.
And one alto clarinet, so I'm a pretty strong player, but whenever I'm on it in the group, it's hard to put a dent in thick ensemble settings. With 4 or 6, no problemo.
We've got this perfect storm of, yes, we had some bad instruments made, we had some bad mouthpieces made, but we have that on every single instrument. I mean, I play the bassoon. Half the bassoons out there are terrible instruments, but because they cost $5,000, nobody's going to really complain about it. And because, you got to have the bassoon. But, that said, there are some clunkers out there. The worst bassoon is far worse than the worst alto clarinet, assuming both are in proper working order. Oh, that gets me back to some repair stuff. When I first got my alto clarinet a couple months ago, the first thing I noticed on it are the pads that the last repair tech put on were saxophone pads. The big, thick orange pads, and they're just simply too thick for the alto. My guess is that's probably all they had.
Wow.
That would fit the large pad size.
Yeah, that's not going to work.
And that will create the stuffiness that people complain about. Well, that's just because the instrument was poorly maintained. That's not the instrument's fault. That's the repair tech's fault or the band director's fault.
Oh, that's part of the problem. Oh, it's an E flat like the alto saxophone. I'm betting these pads will fit just fine.
Right. So, I took them out and they were quite a bit thicker than I put in fancy kangaroo leather pads on my alto that, are much thinner. Worked a lot better. It took a while to have to readjust all the key heights, though. And I'm still working on that on the alto.
Yes, and you were able to get a pad specific to your brand of alto, too, right?
Right, and I went through musicmedic.com, and I will plug them. They had absolutely fantastic service. First set of pads I got did not fit the instrument, and I emailed them as soon as I found out. They sent me, no questions asked, replacement set, absolutely perfect. So I would give a big shout out to musicmedic.com there.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, and they even threw in some extra corks with it, so really, really fantastic service and good product.
Excellent, excellent. And those pads were a dramatic improvement on your alto clarinet, right?
Right. And like I said, I'm still adjusting some pad height because the instrument was adjusted for those thick saxophone pads. But that again leads us to this perfect storm that we've had: bad mouthpiece, coupled to mediocre instrument. And then I think the real problem is bad composing and bad directing. Not the conducting, but the directing, where you put your weakest player, your last chair, third clarinet on the alto clarinet.
Yes.
As a clarinet teacher, as a clarinet performer, who in the B-flat clarinet section, or the bass clarinet section for that matter, should be playing the alto?
My thought is if you do a chair test, you should put the second player or the third player for the B-flats on the alto. They'll be much more motivated, and they ought to adjust correctly. Or, if you want to move a bass player, you move your top bass clarinetist. He'll have been working on developing his clarino register, which matches the alto clarinet's strongest range. And given that he's already gotten used to a looser mouthpiece, which is the biggest difficulty moving from B-flat clarinet to alto, really relaxing your embouchure, alto might be a cakewalk for him, if you will.
Yeah, it's my thoughts as a band director would be, if I had a big enough section, I'd put at least the first chair's second clarinet player. That way, they're going to have a much more independent part. They're still a good, strong player.
Yes, you also have to really explain and convince the player that their part is extremely important, that they matter, and it's imperative to the ensemble that they play it with strength.
Right. And, one thing I found out this last year teaching is you make the kids think that the instrument is unusual, you make them think it's rare, and they are immediately much more attracted to that instrument.
Brilliant.
And that's just a psychological thing. I'd said when I first got to the band program, I said, we don't have any bass clarinets, we don't have any bassoons, we don't have any oboes, we don't have any horns. How do I fix this? The Rare and Unusual Instrument Club. As soon as you put the word rare up there, kids want to do it. It's a psychological thing.
That's genius, man.
The problem is I still never had enough players to cover all the parts. So I only had 5 B-flat clarinet players on my top band. No way I'm going to be able to cover alto. I didn't have a bass at all. So bass had to have been my first priority.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Though if you had 5 if they were really strong, I guess you could justify one on a part for the 3 parts, 1 alto, 1 bass. But that's a bit of a gray area that I fully understand.
Yeah, that was a gray area, and I had 3 strong players and 2 very weak players, and just it wasn't going to work until I had another player, thankfully, move in who was a bass clarinet player. But if you're dealing with small school, junior high bands, that's kind of the situation. If you've got a limited number of players, alto is kind of your bottom thing that you have to be worried about.
It's an easy thing to cut.
So let's see, we've covered different instrument makes. We've covered player's perspective. We've covered it from the role of the band director. We've covered it from really the role of the composer. What else do you think we need to cover on alto clarinet?
Well, we touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to hear what you think about its combination with other instruments. Where does the alto shine in doubling?
Absolutely. I have yet to find, within the woodwind section anyway, an instrument the alto clarinet does not mix well with. If we take basset horn as being an alto clarinet, Mozart showed us that alto clarinet and bassoon is a fantastically beautiful combination. And likewise with English horn. I did that, like I said, in my piece Omnia. Alto clarinet and piccolo. Granger actually loved that combination. The 2 big alto clarinet solos in Lincolnshire are all with piccolo. I could see alto clarinet going very well with alto flute, a real mellow sound. Alto clarinet and saxophone, you'd need some creative counterpoint there to make it work. I think the saxophone can, in some ways, dominate the alto clarinet sound a little bit. There are absolutely creative ways of doing it, but I think alto clarinet and tenor sax, you mix them together. In fact, any clarinets plus sax, you mix them together, you're going to get a much more almost harmonium-like sound.
Yeah, I agree. Well, one thought I've had with alto clarinet and saxophone combinations is the clarino of the alto clarinet plus the soprano saxophone might make for a good combination.
Yeah, that could be really, really nice. Another thing is really some of the low fourth horn stuff. The low notes of the alto clarinet will just blend seamlessly in with a horn choir. It'd be much more flexible than the horn is down at that low register.
Very much so. Very much so.
Or, second horn if you want to have like bass clarinet doubling fourth horn.
Yes, well, with a section of 2 altos and 2 basses, you could, very reasonably, double them with 4 horns and try to create an otherworldly choir effect, if you will.
Oh, I like that idea. So basically have 2 altos, 2 bass clarinets. Alto 1, alto 2, bass 1, bass 2.
Yeah. Like, I don't want to say it's a knockoff of the Wagner tuba concept, but it kind of is, it kind of isn't,
I could see that a little bit. A lot of composers would use saxophones kind of as their woodwind Wagner tubas. Dandy in Fairval used 4 saxophones for a very much otherworldly effect in the second act. Fantastic sound. He just brings in the saxophones to give this almost angelic sound that you couldn't have gotten any other way. The low clarinet quartet plus horns, or just the low clarinet quartet in general. I mean, you don't hear that sound.
I was just thinking that's the key to breaking the bland as vanilla band stereotype. A quartet of low clarinets, you can pair that with muted trombones
Oh,
and play
yeah.
chorales. If you have four trombones, you could pair it with tubas. You can do a lot of things, and even if you're feeling adventurous, you can combine the upper notes of the alto clarinet, which speak well all the way up to its top G, with trumpet, muted trumpet. There's just a lot of things you can do with a low quartet of clarinets.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And then add below that a contralto and a contrabass, and you do that, and you've really changed the whole dynamic of the concert band.
Very much so. Well, I was reading that fantastic Granger article you transcribed, and he was talking about how for Mozart and Haydn's music, a lot of the melodic material was above middle C, C4. So oboes and flutes and clarinets could really rule melodically. But as we shifted into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it moved down into, if you will, the viola's range, with people like Delius and Debussy writing expansive melodic parts in this lower range. And that's what we can capitalize on, I think.
Right, and that's something going back to that Granger article. I'll link to that in the show notes. But Granger was spot on that the melody in the classical era was very much flutes, oboes, violins. As you get into the Romantic era, you're going to see that the pitch level drop and drop and drop, so that you'll get more bass instruments taking the melody. However, if we look at constituency of a modern concert band, if you look at the number of bass instruments there, it's really weak. Within the woodwind section, you've got two bassoons, bass clarinet, bari sax, tenor sax. You've really got, 5 instruments.
It's just not enough.
It's not enough, and that's and you look at an orchestra, you've got 12 cellos and 8 double basses. There's a huge disparity there, and I think we can go a long way with 2 alto clarinets, 2 bass clarinets. We've now gone from that 5, we've now gone to 8. Add in a contralto and a contrabass clarinet, we're now at 10. Add in a contrabassoon, we're at 11. Add in a bass sax, we're at 12. You go from 5 instruments to 12 instruments in that low section. That's huge. That's game-changing for a wind ensemble.
Well, that switches us from the really bright Salvation Army band sound that we have now to something much more darker, and I'm not sure how to best describe it, but concert ensemble-ish, if you will.
Right. It's much more balanced. I mean, I like to look at a choir. Look at a choir, and a well-balanced choir is going to have equal numbers of sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses. Now, a lot of times you'll have smaller groups of the male voices just because it's simply harder to find male singers. But ideally, you want equal numbers of all of it. And a concert band doesn't have that. It's just put it in the tuba. We'll be fine.
Oh, yes, that's another problem. The tuba shouldn't act as the bass instrument for, I think more than a third of the time, because it just gets monotonous.
It very much does. You look at how a tuba functions in an orchestra, and it's 10% of the time, maybe?
Definitely. And it's allowed to function then as a solo instrument or an effect instrument and call out really strong motifs in its registers,
And I think another good ensemble to look at is the British Brass Band. I love the sound of a British brass band, but look at their low end section, and it's 2 B-flat tubas, 2 E-flat tubas, 2 euphoniums, 2 baritones, so that's 8 instruments there. Add on to that 3 trombones, that's 11 instruments in the bass range.
Yes.
You've got 3 tenor horns there, 3 alto horns, and then you've got 12 cornets and a flugelhorn, so you've got 16 versus 11. Almost totally balanced.
Yes, and there's nothing like the sound of the British brass band,
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, I love that sound with all those instruments that a concert band never uses, particularly the alto horn and the baritone horn.
Oh, yes. Nah, we've got horns. That's fine. you know?
Yeah, but they're totally different instruments.
Absolutely. That's what I'm trying to communicate.
Yeah, yeah. But
And a full family of cornets. That's
yeah.
what does it, I think. Because the alto horn's a member of the cornet family, right? And so is the baritone.
In theory, kind of. I mean, it's not exact. They're compromise instruments between the tuba family and the cornet family, but my experience is they're closer to cornets. This gets us back to alto clarinet. Its role it really should be in a concert band vital. We want to talk about it potentially in an orchestra setting?
Certainly. I think there's a lot of potential there, too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, alto clarinet plus viola, I think, really is... Because you don't have another wind instrument that can really support the viola line. You don't have a wind instrument in that range.
Yes, and one thing I would like to observe, too, is that when you take a B-flat clarinet and you put it in the lower register, if the player pushes projection too much, it ends up being really dull and ringing, which just isn't the sound you want when you're doubling the viola, you know?
Whereas the alto clarinet will have a little bit more flexibility down there.
Yes, and in the orchestra, too, if we're just going by woodwinds and threes, or, well, no, more realistically, we'd be in woodwinds and fours at this point. There's no other tenor instrument, per se. The two bassoons, when they're freed up by the bass clarinet, can act as tenor instruments, kind of.
Right. As a bassoon player, I always think bassoon is a tenor instrument, which means that the woodwind family doesn't have a really good stable bass other than bass clarinet.
And the alto clarinet then also frees up the bass clarinet to be more of a bass instrument too, because it can play bass clarinet excerpts, like in the staff and above the staff, much more effectively, I think, than the bass ever could.
There's a world of possibilities. Now, one thing I'd say is in orchestra, players are going to want to use the basset horn more than they will want to use the E-flat alto clarinet. Timbre-wise, what do you see as differences between the alto clarinet and the basset horn?
The basset horn is a little bit more veiled. It's a little bit darker. Its sound overall, I think, is a lot less robust, especially the really small bore models. It could never function as a military band instrument just because of its lack of projection capability, which is why they use the alto clarinet. And the alto clarinet is stronger. It's dark, but it also sings a little bit in my ears. I was just thinking, a good correlation between these two instruments, ideally, if you have a small bore basset horn and a large bore alto, is the same relationship that a bass oboe and a heckelphone have, Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. The bass oboe being a narrow bore instrument, whereas the heckelphone is just this gigantically overproportioned bass oboe.
Yes. Isn't it similar to the saxophone's contour?
Yeah, heckelphone is actually a lot closer to a saxophone bore. So it's almost too powerful in some regards.
Oh, yes. Should make it useful for jazz if Heckel ever started making them again. But, back to the alto and basset. Sometimes it's hard to hear, but I think there's a difference. We both played on the Prestige alto clarinet, and then on the large bore LeBlanc basset horn at TMEA.
And I did not hear much of a timbral difference between those two instruments. Could you?
I kind of could and I kind of couldn't. So the LeBlanc instrument had the same bore as its alto clarinet. So it was actually a larger and more robust clarinet than the Prestige alto clarinet.
So the LeBlanc basset horn is really an F alto clarinet.
Absolutely.
It's not a true basset horn.
Not even a little bit.
Other than the fact it's in F.
Yes.
Now, for orchestral stuff, I think having the instrument in F makes a little bit more sense. because it's not, you're going to be getting sharp keys. You're going to be getting, things that the E flat instrument will just make awkward. So you have a piece in the key of D, string player's favorite key. Well, that means the E flat alto clarinet's going to be put in the key of B major.
Oh yes, much fun.
Right. So you've got 5 sharps, whereas if you have the basset horn, you'd be playing in 3 sharps. A is much more doable.
Very much so. And, for orchestral combinations, I think I'm still on the fence because I do favor the E-flat instrument. But ideally, those instruments ought to be able to function each on their own, I think. And we're both going to be doing experiments with our alto clarinets, extending them down to C. So, I don't know. What do you think of E-flat alto versus the F alto clarinet now?
I think the player is going to have a much... the player will notice a bigger difference as opposed to the listener. I think once you get out into the hall, the listener's not going to hear as big of a difference as the player who's physically handling the instrument will.
Oh, yes. Well, I was playing a gig a couple of nights ago, and I was playing clarinet. And one of the audience members complimented me on my flute playing. So, the listener's gonna... Nice.
Yeah, that's sad right there. But, in a big concert hall with, the instrument's not going to be in the front row, so the audience won't see them directly. I don't think the audience is going to hear that huge of a difference. Particularly if you have, good mouthpiece on there. Some of the alto clarinet mouthpieces will make the alto clarinet sound more like a basset horn.
Yes. There are 2 different profiles. The Selmer basset horns, the ones I played on in school, which I really enjoyed, are small bore instruments, and they used B-flat clarinet mouthpieces. Whereas the LeBlanc basset horn uses alto clarinet mouthpieces. Like my B44 worked perfectly on that,
I don't think the audience is going to know too much.
Nope.
Real indifference.
And it would have to be a perfect storm situation with a player who's found the smallest bore basset horn he could possibly find next to a souped-up alto clarinet that's had its bore enlarged and extended and has a jazz mouthpiece on. Then maybe they'd be able to tell.
There, you're probably hearing as much of the mouthpiece difference as you are an instrument difference.
You have a point, yeah.
In a perfect world, we'd be able to hear a slight difference. I think you can point really to there's that great video of Molk Wolbers you talked about earlier, where they're doing Mozart basset horn trio on 2 basset horns and an alto clarinet. And can you hear a difference in the alto clarinet? I can't even tell which part it's playing.
My mind tells me that I want to hear one, but I can't.
Yeah, and I think that kind of really proves the point that there's not a huge timbral difference between the alto clarinet and the basset horn. So that would lead me to say, why aren't we performing the Mozart Requiem on alto clarinets instead of B-flat clarinets?
Certainly. Because that's where the timbral difference gets more dramatic. I mean, even your Turkish clarinet and the alto clarinet sound fundamentally different,
Absolutely. In fact, look, we could talk about my G clarinet just a little bit, because I mentioned that the alto clarinet is properly a tenor instrument. Well, I've got a G clarinet. It's in the simple system fingering style, sometimes called a Turkish clarinet, and that to me really is an alto instrument. It's got same bore, same mouthpiece as a B-flat clarinet, but it goes down to B2. So the lowest note is the B right below viola's open string C.
As I observed, it has the exact same range as the bass oboe. And it's much more dramatic difference between the B-flat than the A and the B-flat, as you've observed too, right?
Absolutely. It doesn't really match the sound of my B-flat clarinet at all. And, I've got a cheap Chinese instrument that sucks, quite frankly. But, you get a good one of these and put this on your alto line, put the alto clarinet, which is properly a tenor clarinet on your tenor line, and you've got a very different sound. In fact, third clarinets in band could be put on the G clarinet, and now you've got a new timbral possibility.
Well, in your symphony Alpine, I remember some of the early sketches had a pair of E flats, a pair of C's, a pair like 4 B flats, 2 A's, 2 F altos, and 2 basses. I'd love to see the combination of 2 E flats, 2 C's. You've got your high quartet. 2 B flats, 2 G's. You've got a middle low quartet. 2 altos, 2 basses. You've got your low quartet, and then your contralto and a contrabass.
Right. Now, I did some adjusting to that. I haven't worked on that in quite a while. I took out the second pair of B flats, so it was 2 B flats and 2 A's. But that a little bit close because the A is by far the more common instrument.
Certainly.
Not like that piece is practical on any means, but that was kind of the plan. The quartet of highs, the quartet of middles, the quartet of lows.
Yes, a la Mahler.
Even Mahler didn't go there. Mahler, for all his clarinet extravagance, never once scored for basset horn. He scored for every other clarinet he had available to him.
Yeah, I think you showed me a part from Symphony 3 or 4 where a player has to have E flat, D, C, B flat, A, and bass clarinet,
Bass clarinet. There's one where it has to have bass clarinet in B flat and bass clarinet in A as well.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, so I think there's one symphony where clarinet 3 has to have 6 instruments. Usually it gets pared down to 4 because nobody's got a bass clarinet.
Not quite, but yeah, it's funny that he was so extensive, but he was really liberal while being really conservative with his instrumentation at the same time.
In some regards, I think he actually got more conservative instrumentation-wise as he got older. In some ways, Symphony 8, the Symphony of 1,000, is the most conservative instrumentation-wise, even if it is the biggest. That's hard to believe for a lot of people, too.
Definitely.
He doesn't have the extravagancies that the other symphonies do, particularly in clarinet department.
Yeah. I'm eventually just going to be an advocate for a clarinet ensemble that has an A flat clarinet, 2 E flats, 2 D's, 2 C's, 2 B flats, 2 A's, 2 G's. It would be such a diverse sound.
Yeah, and that goes back to there's that great footnote in Strauss's edition of the Berlioz Treatise where he talks about an expanded clarinet section.
Oh, yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly.
In fact, I've got that book just behind me. Let me grab it, and I'll just read out what Strauss thinks would have been a perfect clarinet ensemble. In fact, there's several bits of that one footnote that are very, very tantalizing.
Like the double bass oboe.
Right. He hints at it. He gives no description of it, but he says he heard one, and he wanted to write for one. So we've got this weird situation there. So this is Strauss's perfect clarinet ensemble. This is from his, I believe, 1902, 1903 edition of the Berlioz Treatise. 1 A-flat clarinet, 2 clarinets in F, 2 clarinets in E-flat, 4 or 6 clarinets in B-flat, 2 basset horns, 1 bass clarinet, and 1 contrabass clarinet. Now, of course, the F clarinets are completely extinct. The contralto clarinet was not really a thing at that point, so got a lot of color there.
Very much so.
Been interesting to see if Strauss ever would have done that, but I think he was a little bit more adventurous in his youth and got much more conservative as he got older.
Oh, yes. Well, he didn't use the heckelphone after Alpine. And
after 1914, he only used heckelphone in Salome Electra, Alpine Symphony, Joseph's Legend, and the Festische Prelude. So 5 pieces there. He did use basset horn quite a bit after that.
Yeah, I've been looking for those opera scores. They're a little bit harder to find, but I know he used basset horns in quite a few.
But Electra is really the big one. I think Rosenkavalier.
Yes, there's also yeah, that's the one. That's the one I'm thinking of.
Capriccio.
Capriccio, yes, that one too. There's no other section in the band, I think, and I may be wrong. The saxophones may be close, with as many extant members of its species still around. Like, there's just so much diversity of clarinets still available.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at instruments that are currently being manufactured right now, you've got A flat, E flat, D, C, B flat, A, G, basset horn, alto, bass, contralto, contrabass. That's 12 instruments in the family that are currently being manufactured.
Yes.
Compare saxophones, you've got the piccolo, the sopranino, soprano in C, soprano in B flat, alto, tenor in C, tenor in B flat, baritone, bass, contrabass, and there's a couple places making the subcontrabass. So that's 11. It's almost a tie.
Yeah. Yes, it's almost a tie.
Clarinet ekes it out.
Yeah, and that depends on whether you count that mad Canadian Stephen Fox's experiments with the bass clarinet in A.
Oh, and I didn't, so... has he even made one?
I don't know. I know a couple of his clarinets have found their way into, like, the West Coast, like his bass clarinets.
But the actual construction of an A clarinet, we don't know about.
Yeah, like his bass clarinets, his B-flat bass clarinets.
Right.
Yeah, his A clarinets I don't know about, but it's a fascinating opportunity, you know?
So I think we have, for the day, kind of exhausted ourselves on alto clarinet in all its various forms. You got anything you want to plug, Matt?
Oh, well, I've decided to start work, so I'm a composer with nothing published. I've got a couple of sketches here and there, but I'd like to start working on a piece for alto clarinet, strings, and percussion. I'm not sure if I'm going to call it a concerto per se, but the sketches are there. I have a melody, a development, secondary melody. I've got everything for a first movement that I just have to put together. Does that kind of jive with what you do when you compose, you know?
Not really. When I compose, I start at the beginning and I just start writing. I kind of formless. It depends on the piece. You know, I did write that piece for you this week. I sat down and one day you asked me to write a piece for alto clarinet and marimba, and I cranked out that piece. And first chamber piece I've written in years, but got that done for you. And for me, I've just started on Wednesday. Earlier this week, I had a friend in Estonia ask me to write a double concerto for soprano and tenor saxophone, and that is going along really well. First day on that, in about 7 hours of work, I cranked out 35 pages of full score.
Jeez, man, that's impressive.
Well, when you're dealing with every measure is nothing but 30-second notes, that's also 35 measures. But,
I dig it.
To finally wrap up, you can read all of the Bandistration musings at bandistration.com. I am currently working on the course in band orchestration. It'll be the first modern course in band orchestration since probably the 50s. And the eventual goal to that will be to have 3 published books, one on instrumentation, one on orchestration that is currently being written right now. And then final book will be a 101, 150 problems in band orchestration. And of that, use of alto clarinet will just be one of them. If you want to support that project, I've set up a Patreon account. You can find that through links on the Bandistration site. I've got whole bunch of pieces that I've recently published on Sheet Music Plus. Again, those are all found on Bandistration site. Anything else you want to add into that, Matt?
Well, no, I'll suggest our listeners to support Brett because band orchestration needs to take a big leap forward. And the only piece of work I can find about like bandistration, what we've been talking about, is this old volume by Frank Erickson, which gets the ranges of instruments wrong, and it's a niche market that badly needs to be improved, and Brett is hard at work at that, so I advocate it very strongly.
There is one other book. There's Joseph Wagner band scoring. But again, that was published in the 50s, and it has multiple errors in it. But
yeah, it's amazing how many errors get through with these things. Like,
yeah, my biggest pet peeve is all the errors in the ad lib.
oh yes, his stuff about the B-flat contrabass clarinet is just wrong. Just,
oh yeah.
like, goodness.
So a lot of that stuff for the auxiliary instruments, that book's unusable. I haven't seen the 4th edition, but I've heard he does some really bad things in the band scoring chapter, which was supposed to be the big improvement. But anyway, I think we've rambled on here for nearly an hour and a half.
Man, look at us.
So, yeah. So this is the first episode of the Instrumentarium podcast. Subscribe through iTunes, and I'll be putting up links to this on the Bandistration site. And so, I don't have anything else to say. You have anything else, Matt?
Not at all, Brett. Not at all.
All right. Well, good talking to you. And that's it for this one.